Thank you to Incogni for sponsoring this episode. When we imagine exciting aircraft, we tend to picture fast, sleek fighters. Rarely do we give a second glance to the hulking, pot-bellied cargo haulers lumbering through the sky. But there is one such lumbering beast that has such a fascinating development history that I believe deserves to have its story told, and by the end I think you'll agree. The Fairchild C-123 Provider is the only aircraft to fly as a glider, a prop plane, a jet, an amphibian, a prop jet hybrid, and a turboprop. It was even the testbed for a prototype vertical lift aircraft. But to really understand the C-123, we have to start with a daring raid in World War II. In the early morning hours of September 12, 1943, over the Gran Sasso mountain range, 10 assault gliders carrying elite German paratroopers descended silently through the night sky. Their target? Albergo de Campo Imperatore, which was perched almost 7,000 feet up on a remote peak where deposed dictator Benito Mussolini was being held. Inside, El Duce sat defeated and imprisoned, guarded by 200 Italian carabinieri. He had no ideas his rescuers were about to crash through the doors in a raid so audacious, so surgical, that it would become the blueprint for modern airborne special operations. A mission made possible thanks to a glider built from little more than canvas and wood. This is the story of the Fairchild C-123, an unlikely aircraft that began life as a glider, almost obsolete but resurrected in Vietnam, where she would become both loved and loathed in equal measure, saving lives one day and taking them the next. So as always, grab a brew, some custard creams, and let's get into what might just be one of the most fascinating and controversial aircraft we've ever covered on the channel, because wherever there was action, there was the Bookie Bird. Prior to liberating Mussolini, German forces had first used the assault glider on May 10, 1940 during the Battle of Belgium, followed by running critical supply drops to encircle troops on Eastern Front, and again in the war's final days where they were used to resupply a besieged Berlin. Naturally, the Allies had quickly recognized the tactical advantages of gliders and never once let a good idea go to waste. The US ramped up production of their own types, with 14 American companies beginning construction for the United States Army Air Force by the thousands. The most common was the cargo glider, or the CG-4A, otherwise known as the Waco after the Waco Aircraft Company. I'm sure you'll correct my pronunciation in the comments, although its service name would be Hadrian, and would be the only American-built glider to see active service in World War II. In England, General Aircraft Limited produced the Hamilcar, which was used in Operation Market Garden and Overlord, where the assault glider more than proved its worth. However, everyone soon realized that gliders, although cheap and quick to build, were one-way tickets, since once on the ground, they were sitting ducks, and vulnerable until they could be retrieved, if at all. With this in mind, the Germans converted over 100 Gotha GO-242 gliders, fitting them with Gnome Rhone engines, while their massive Messerschmitt Me-321 glider, initially intended to support large-scale invasions, was given 6 of the Gnome Rhone engines, creating a huge Me-323 Gigant. In America, the Waco company installed engines of various types on a few CG-4 gliders, producing the experimental PG-1 powered glider series. In England, General Aircraft Limited added a pair of engines to the Hamilcar, transforming it into the Hamilcar X. While neither Allied designs were produced in large numbers like the German models, it did show that a glider design could be adapted to a powered aircraft. However, as the war drew to a close, the manufacturers who had built thousands of gliders began to step away, seeing little future in the concept. But there were still some who saw promise in the idea and, with post-war potential and profit to be made, got to work. Michael Strukov was one of those men. A refugee from the Russian Revolution, he'd arrived in America in 1922, first working as an architect and then co-founding the Chase Aircraft Company in 1943, initially in New York City before moving to West Trenton, New Jersey. Strukov was not only the president of Chase, but also its chief engineer. He soon began working on a series of heavy-lift gliders for the US Airborne Forces that could even carry the large artillery pieces. From this simple requirement, The fascinating development history of the C-123 began with a series of gliders and powered aircraft with a dizzying range of names and designations that chopped and changed. So to maintain our sanity, we're going to stick with the most salient models. Because trying to keep track of all these shifting designations and prototypes was a real job when researching this story, quite overwhelming. Kind of like staying on top of your personal data these days, and that brings us to this video's sponsor, Incogni, a service that helps you take back control of your personal data. I've been a network engineer for nearly 30 years and taught cybersecurity for over a decade, so trust me when I say your private data is everywhere. Personally, I don't trust most companies with my information unless it's a bank or something unavoidable. I avoid handing it over. Why? Because even when you think you're being careful, and I thought I had been, it still gets quietly collected by data brokers, then shared, sold, and sometimes ends up on a dark web where scammers can try to steal your identity. In fact, a recent report found that in 72% of elder fraud cases, personal data exposure, often through data brokers, was a key factor. Victims had their details harvested and used to tailor scams directly to them. That's why when Incogni reached out to sponsor this video, I was more than happy to say yes. Incogni contacts over 230 data brokers on your behalf, using laws like GDPR and CCPA to demand your data be deleted. You get a dashboard showing who has your info, who's removed it, and who's still dragging their feet. Seeing just how many had my data, eye-opening. So no more spam calls, junk email, or unwanted text. A big thank you to Incogni for sponsoring this video, and right now you can get 60% off an annual plan with my code Aviation Republic at the link in the description. Take back control of your data today with Incogni. Now back to Strukov. The company's first two assault gliders were designated XCG-14 and 14A. These were constructed mainly from wood, with a capacity to carry 16 and 32 troops, respectively. These first flew in 1944 and 1945. Although they didn't go into production, they did provide a basis for further work on all-metal gliders. What followed were two of these all-metal machines, the MS-6 or XCG-18A, which had an increased capacity that could carry 32 fully equipped soldiers or a 10,000-pound payload, and had that distinctive upswept roof fuselage, the first of the C-123 design clues. In the spring of 1948, although the Air Force had ordered 5 of the company's new improved YG-18A gliders for service evaluation, limitations behind the whole concept were glaring and obvious, because once it touched down it was grounded, easy pickings for enemy fire, or a complete logistical headache for recovery. Strukov, realizing that the Air Force was quickly losing interest in the concept, finally saw that maybe he was clinging onto a flawed idea, and that the future lay in designing an aircraft that could combine the glider's simplicity with the flexibility of a powered aircraft. Now with this notion, he fitted the second YG-18 with a pair of Pratt & Whitney R2000 radial engines, creating the YC-122. 2 additional prototypes followed, the first designated YC-22A, which incorporated a series of refinements over the original. The second of these was later modified and redesignated as the YC-122B, swapping out the original Pratt & Whitney engines for a pair of Wright R1820 Cyclones. Now seeing these new machines, the United States Air Force was once again interested and ordered a trial batch of 9 YC-122s to be constructed. This model would become known as the MS-7 Avitruck or YC-122C. Certainly not a fast machine with a top speed of 240 miles an hour, but could cruise along at a very sedate 200 for around 2,900 miles. The YC-122C was a short-lived machine, but it had some interesting features, like a hydraulically operated ramp and cargo doors, with a low floor just 30 inches above the ground. Although the nose gear could be retracted, the main gear was fixed in place. One novel feature was the position of the fuel tanks in the engine nacelles that could be jettisoned in an emergency. Even so, their performance was too poor to be considered for tactical airlift, even though they could carry 30 fully laden troops or a 105mm howitzer plus 1 jeep. After briefly operating with the Air Force, they were ultimately parked up after a few years' service. Some were scrapped and 1 or 2 entered private hands, if nothing else for their valuable engines. As a side note, one YC-122C airframe was later used as the Hiller X-18 experimental tilt-wing and vertical lift aircraft testbed. But sometimes there's an itch you need to scratch, and the next attempt was the itch that would lead in a roundabout sort of way to the C-123. The MS-8 Avi truck had begun life as another glider, initially designated XG-20 with the establishment of the USAF. Like its predecessors, it was designed as a high-wing all-metal aircraft with a cavernous cargo hold and capable of carrying 60 troops or 50 litter patients. Although the glider had a maximum takeoff weight of 70,000 pounds, which was incredible, it was soon found that there was no tow aircraft that could get such a lump into the air, so the maximum takeoff weight was limited to 40,000 pounds. The second XG-20 underwent extensive flight testing, during which it was compared to various other transport aircraft. Although it showed no significant deficiencies, the tests clearly demonstrated that powered assault transports could match gliders in landing performance, and therefore once the tests were completed, it was returned to Chase, where an interesting and unusual fate awaited. As a result of these trials, the concept of the assault glider had become obsolete, thus leading to the cancellation of the XG-20 glider project. Still, Strukov, always thinking ahead, had ensured that the airframe could be fitted with engines, a decision that would define his and his company's future. Seeing that attaching engines to the glider seemed to produce a half-decent aircraft, Strukov took one of the XG-20 prototype airframes and fitted it with 2 Pratt & Whitney R2800 CB-15 radials, creating the XC-123, the blueprint for what would ultimately become the C-123 Provider. On October 14, 1949, the XC-123 first took to the skies above Trenton, but no longer a glider, but a powered transport, which interestingly flew months before its sister, the second prototype glider, underwent trials with the USAF on the 26th of April 1950. Due to a quirky holdover from its glider routes, the wings of the XC-123 hadn't been designed to store any fuel, therefore lacking the space for internal tanks. So in the XC-123, fuel was stored in the cells behind the engine, and should the pilot find himself in a tight spot and needing to make a forced landing, he could jettison the fuel tanks, reverting it to a glider, something that Billy should have known before landing at that former World War II Japanese airstrip. Comment below if you got that reference. Strukov, now eyeing that second prototype which had been rejected as a glider by the USAF, had a wild idea. Rather than scrapping it, he decided to fit it with 4 General Electric J47 5,200 pound turbojets, 2 per pod under each wing, much like the Boeing Stratojet. Here he created the XC-123A, which had the distinction of becoming the first American all-jet powered cargo hauler. When it first flew on April 21, 1951, it managed to hit 500 miles an hour, a blistering speed for a transport aircraft, and would be the fastest that any C-123 would ever fly. Now with these 4 jets, it could lift up to 60,000 pounds, with the fuel now carried under the cargo floor. Although it was a good short-field machine, its low-slung jet pods had a habit of inhaling debris on unpaved runways. This severely limited its tactical and operational use to paved airstrips, plus its range paled compared to its piston-powered XC-123 sister. So once again, the Air Force sent the jet-powered machine back to Chase, instructing them to replace the 4 J-47s with a pair of Wright radial engines and designate it to the YC-123D. This single airframe now had done it all, first as a glider, then as a jet-powered transport, and now had piston engines. But Strukov was not yet finished. There was more in store for the YC-123D and her amphibious sister, which we'll come back to later on. On the other hand, the Air Force was impressed by the short-field performance of the tough little XC-123. Seeing it as a strong candidate for tactical airlift, they placed an order for 300 aircraft designated C-123B. This massive order was both a blessing and a curse for Strukov. While it was a major win, Chase was a small outfit, and therefore lacked the manufacturing muscle to produce all 300 planes, and they understood they needed help. So they went out looking for the muscle they needed, but what they ended up doing was handing the keys of the henhouse to a very voracious fox. Enter the fox, otherwise known as Henry J. Kaiser, an industrial titan who, like a fox, saw an opportunity in the C-123 contract, leading his firm, Kaiser Fraser Corporation, into acquiring a minority 49% stake in Chase. His intent was to build the aircraft at his massive Willow Run plant in Michigan, which had been churning out the B-24 Liberators during the war. While Kaiser was preparing the factory for mass production, Chase had already begun assembling the first of the 5 C-123Bs in Trenton. These initial aircraft further refined the XC-123 design by upgrading the engines to a pair of 2500 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2899W power plants. There were some other refinements, although it did retain those engine nacelle fuel tanks. Not satisfied with only part of the pie, Kaiser bought the remaining 51% of Chase for $1.75 million, or about $20 million in 2025 money. Although he thought they had the whole 123 contract in the bag, his ambitions were about to hit a wall after only 2 aircraft had been constructed. During this time, his contract to build a Fairchild C-119 was already mired in cost overruns. The many political enemies in Washington's various procurement departments who he had made during the war believed that he'd been ripping them off. They now sensed an opportunity to seek a bit of vengeance, and they launched a Senate subcommittee investigation in 1953. The investigation determined that there had been financial improprieties, or in layman terms, Kaiser had been cooking the books and overcharging Uncle Sam. Thus, in June of that year, the Air Force notified Kaiser that no further contracts would be honoured once the current batch of C-119s was finished. This meant that that huge 300 aircraft order for which he had purchased Chase was now effectively worthless. The cancellation of the contract halted work on 12 semi-complete C-123B airframes at Willow Run. Strukov, who'd poured his soul into the design, was gutted, even more so due to an unusual clause in the contract. The Air Force reserved the right to manufacture and could effectively hand the design to any aircraft constructor it chose without having to pay royalties to the original designer. So not only did he lose the contract, but he also lost the patent rights and any financial rewards that came with it. The contract was put up for bid, with most of the American firms throwing their hats into the ring. Fairchild, North American, Martin, Covert and Lockheed all vied for the deal. In the end it landed, excuse the pun, with Fairchild in Hagerstown, Maryland, a seasoned manufacturer whose experienced production line was expected to churn out the C-123B. And so in August 1953, the half-built C-123 airframes at Willow Run were shipped by rail to Hagerstown to form the first production batch, where Fairchild went to work further refining the design. However, because they were also handed a contract to complete the remaining batch of C-119s, which would have gone to Kaiser had he not tried to fiddle those books, space at the Hagerstown factory was scarce, and with delays to tool up and train the workforce, deliveries were slowed down. But we've not heard the last from Strukov, who refused to let his dream die. He would go on to found Strukov Aircraft in a last-ditch effort to salvage what he could from the wreckage of the henhouse. We'll come back to him in a bit and his very unusual creation. The initial run of Fairchild C-123B aircraft differed little from the few Chase had built and was, to a certain extent, a utilitarian marvel. It had a 110-foot wingspan and a 75-foot 9-inch fuselage with a cargo hold 35 feet long, 12 inches wide and 10 feet high, and quite capable of carrying either 61 troops or 50 stretcher patients, alternatively 24,000 pounds of cargo. A hydraulically operated rear ramp meant that vehicles or pallets could be quickly loaded while troop doors on either side allowed for parachute drops. Fuel storage remained idiosyncratic, carried in nacelle tanks holding 4,371 pounds each, later supplemented by drop tanks could hold another 2,646 pounds each, for a total capacity of 14,034 pounds of fuel. In Vietnam, the C-123 or bladder birds would fly numerous fuel delivery missions with a 2,000-gallon bladder in a cargo bay to camps and bases that were cut off by the North Vietnamese, which earned them the name mortar magnets as they were hit so many times. The first Fairchild C-123B, serial number 54552, took to the skies on the 1st of September 1954 from Haggerston, Maryland, piloted by the fantastically named Elvin Relvin Dutch Gelvin, Fairchild's chief test pilot and a product of parents with a sense of humour. The Fairchild-built aircraft differed slightly from the earlier Chase-built versions by the addition of a prominent dorsal fin. During flight testing, engineers identified a directional stability problem, leading to the installation of a large dorsal fin extension at the front of the vertical stabilizer, a modification that became a standard production feature and gave the provider a more pronounced backside in the air appearance. The aircraft's empty weight was 29,900 pounds with a maximum takeoff weight of 60,000. With a very pedestrian cruising speed of 205 miles an hour, it could fly for 1,470 miles, though pilots always commented on a very sluggish climb rate, especially when fully loaded. Once the US began operating the distant early warning line in Alaska in the mid-1950s, the Air Force realized that it needed an aircraft capable of reliably delivering supplies and equipment to the crews stationed at these remote radar sites. The Douglas C-47, then in service, struggled with takeoffs from the snow-covered runways, especially when fully loaded, where extra power was needed just to get airborne. In such conditions, an engine failure on takeoff was essentially a death sentence, so the search began for a more capable cargo hauler. However, the C-123B suffered from the same critical flaw like the C-47. It offered little margin for error, and losing an engine on takeoff could prove fatal. In 1955, General Chester McCarty, commander of the Tactical Air Command, made his position clear. The Air Force wouldn't touch a C-123 without jet augmentation. McCarty was no desk pilot. He was a seasoned aviator with extensive Arctic experience and would go on to fly the first Air Force aircraft over the South Pole in October 1956, airdropping supplies and equipment to support Operation Deep Freeze and the establishment of the South Pole base. Fortunately for the Air Force, it just so happened that Fairchild had already begun experimenting with solving the poor climb rate. They mounted J-44R3 jet engines on the wingtips of the prototype Chase-built C-123B. These were the same ones used on the expendable target drone like the Ryan Firebee. The first testbed, serial 521627, that flew on February 7th, 1955, had a pair of skis which extended and retracted along with the landing gear. Also, a nose gear ski was fitted with a housing that fed into the nose. The jet-assisted configuration showed promise. It improved the aircraft's climb rate from a sluggish 150 feet per minute to a somewhat more respectable 500 feet per minute, even with a one-piston engine feathered on takeoff under full load. However, because of budget constraints and the belief that a Lockheed C-130 Hercules would make it obsolete in a few years, prevented large-scale jet adoption. Only 10 other C-123B aircraft were modified on the production line with ski landing gear and the J-44 engines, which formed the C-123J variant. These hybrids earned the affectionate nickname Ski Birds from pilots who appreciated the jet's extra power during tricky takeoffs, but they often joked that the skis were more reliable than the finicky maintenance-heavy J-44 engines. The first of the type, serial 564394, first flew on October 23, 1957 and served the Alaskan Air National Guard's 144th Transport Squadron until the mid-1970s. The FAA also operated 2 additional providers in Arctic regions for flight checks of navigational aids and instrument landing systems across Alaska. These were similarly modified with wingtip-mounted Continental J69 turbojets derived from the French Turbo Mecha Marbour engine, though it's unclear if they received any special designation. Returning to Stroukov, in 1954, the US Air Force awarded a contract to Stroukov Aircraft to develop a series of STOL and experimental aircraft. Stroukov reacquired the Trenton plant assets with the USAF backing and secured access to the first Willow Run built 123B for modification. This aircraft would become the basis for the experimental YC-123D, which was rebuilt with two R2800 radials and a boundary layer control system. This used suction slots on the upper wing surfaces that improved lift at low speeds. This aircraft first flew on December 7, 1954, and with high-pressure air blown over the wings, it could take off in just 850 feet and land in only 755 feet, almost half the distance of the C-123B. With the success of the YC-123D, Strukhov's follow-on aircraft was to go even further. The YC-123E serial 554031 was a completely new experimental airframe aimed at creating a go-anywhere aircraft that could operate wherever it might be needed, be it on snow, ice, water, mud or rough and unprepared strips. As the video shows, the 123E is operating from water. First flown on July 28, 1955, it was fitted with Strukhov's patented Panto-based system, which consisted of two high-stress skis mounted on the lower fuselage along with wingtip floats. The airframe had a watertight and sealed fuselage. Even the crew doors were sealed, with the crew entering and exiting the aircraft via the rear cargo door. Although from what I could gather, some documents showed a forward door present but smaller and above the waterline. In 1956, Michael Strukov, ever the innovator, took a Chase C-123 prototype and transformed it into the YC-134 under a USAF contract for free aircraft. They fitted it with a boundary layer control system, replaced the engines with 3500 horsepower Wright radials, and added horizontal stabilizer end plates for better directional stability. The main landing gear was also upgraded with dual wheels, but kept the C-123B's dual nose wheel. Fuel storage was shifted from the nacelles to two 1,100-gallon wing tanks with optional 550-gallon drop tanks, now with a total capacity of 3,300 gallons and a 1,600-mile range and a 24,000-pound payload. On December 19, 1956, the YC-134 took flight from West Trenton, New Jersey. Performance-wise, cruising speed was not much better than the C-123B, however the takeoff distance was just 750 feet. Yet despite the glowing test reports, the Air Force cancelled the original contract for three YC-134s, seeing little advantage over the C-123B, and deeming a piston-powered amphibious transport obsolete. And that's where we'll leave Strukov. His innovations ended up like many aircraft of this era, as mere footnotes in history. By 1955, 65 C-123Bs had found a home with the 309th Troop Carrier Group at Ardmore, Oklahoma, becoming the first fixed-wing assault airlift group in the Air Force. However, its time with the 309th was short-lived, being disbanded in March 1957, with the C-123s being passed off to other groups in training wings. By 1958, the Lockheed C-130 had already been in service for 2 years and was beginning to edge out the smaller C-123, and for all intents and purposes it was seen as an obsolete design and ultimately destined for the boneyard. But what saved it from being scrapped and turned into saucepans was its no-nonsense build and knack for landing on short, rough and treacherous strips. These were qualities that made it a godsend for troops, spooks and every other under-the-radar shadowy outfit that needed to move cargo with no questions asked. Because in Vietnam, the Bookie Bird, as she became known, would for many be seen as a hero and a lifesaver. However, another very dark future awaited her, as we'll soon see. I want to take a second here to thank you so much for watching. I'm truly grateful to share my love of aviation with fellow enthusiasts like you. So if you're enjoying this story, please take a quick second to hit the like button. It's a small gesture that makes a huge difference in helping me reach more aviation fans. Now let's get back to the story. By the early 1960s, the United States was becoming increasingly alarmed by the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, particularly in Vietnam. President John F. Kennedy, continuing the Cold War policies of his predecessors, escalated American involvement by expanding military aid and advisory efforts to counter the Viet Cong insurgency and prevent what was feared to be a domino effect of communist takeovers across the region. Among the first tactical responses was Project Mule, which deployed C-123Bs of the 346 Troop Carrier Squadron to Tan Son Nhat Air Base in December 1961. Their mission was to support the South Vietnamese Army by airdropping supplies into remote and contested regions, often under fire and far from established runways. The 346 was generally considered to be the best squadron in the wing and manned by young pilots with an average of 1,800 hours flying time, of which 1,500 of those were in C-123s. If ever an aircraft was in its element, it was a C-123B in Southeast Asia, said one pilot who flew the aircraft in Vietnam. It was slow, ugly, leaked, and it was hot when it was hot and cold when it was cold. But it was fun to fly, just like a big Super Cub. Initially flying in bare metal with red stencil serials, the practically obsolete C-123B providers began operations on January the 3rd under a modest plan. 6 aircraft flying 4 hours a day, but that was soon bumped to 7. It wasn't glamorous work, there were no parades or medals waiting, but for the crews it became some of the most rewarding and satisfying flying jobs of their careers. Often flying into harm's way, the crews operated with little air traffic control in marginal weather. They flew in and out of small airfields in steep mountainous areas and did it all in an aircraft that many had written off as obsolete. In truth, the C-123 was exactly what the mission needed: rugged, simple, and stubbornly reliable. They operated in a barely organised environment with command and control stretched thin. The 3 main radar sites, Da Nang, Tan Son Nhat, and Pleiku, offered minimal support. Instrument approaches were crude, navigation aids were nearly non-existent, and communication relied on the unreliable Vietnamese telephone network. The C-123, born from a glider, was meant to scrape by with just 3 crew aboard: the pilot, the co-pilot, and flight engineer. However, on assignments to far corners of the globe with most airstrips lacking radio beacons, nearly all flights were conducted under Mach 1 eyeball visual flight rules, often in weather well below safe VFR minimums. So it was often found that a navigator was required, and as a result a stowable workbench and seat were precariously installed in the upper roof area of the cargo compartment to accommodate one. These were commonly found on the C-123J ski variants flying around the featureless Arctic. These mule-train crews quickly adapted, pioneering techniques like spiraling up and down through gaps in the cloud and cruising just above the low-hanging cloud deck. Crews often flew blind into valleys with barely 800 feet of clearance and no radar, guided by gut instinct and raw experience alone. Comment below if you would ditch your desk job for that sort of flying, because I know I would. The providers hauled everything: live ducks, chickens, pigs and cows, intermingled with human passengers, sometimes parachuting livestock into remote outposts. Inside the cabin, the tropical heat turned the aircraft into a flying furnace, with sweat-soaked pilots enduring long hours at the controls, with the stench of the cargo that clucked, oinked or mooed, and the racket of the engines added to the cacophony. And on more than one occasion, mule train crews caught a whiff of smoke, only to find a passenger calmly cooking a meal in a cargo bay. Its tough landing gear and glider-strong fuselage could take those rough landings on short primitive strips hacked out the jungle, where stopping depended on the slow approach and touching down on the edge of the field, then full reverse, a steady, heavy foot on the brakes, often on muddy strips that were slippery when wet. Mule train missions in 1962 pushed the C-123 into every imaginable role, from delivering live ducks to dropping propaganda leaflets warning of the dangers of communism and even deploying napalm. For the latter, the provider was loaded with 9 wooden pallets, each carrying 3 55-gallon drums of napalm. With a skilled kicker on board, the entire load could be shoved out the rear ramp in under 5 seconds, leaving behind a 1,200-foot long trail of fire. Despite their successes, the lack of planning and infrastructure frustrated the higher-ups. By October, the Southeast Asia airlift system was introduced, replacing the mule train's seat-of-the-pants style with tighter scheduling and bureaucracy. The era of making it up as you go was over. But the Bookie Bird, apparently a nickname adopted from its radio call sign Bookie, had already proven itself in the field and laid the groundwork for what would follow. During this time, Fairchild had begun developing a variant of the C-123B, focused on further improving its short-field performance and lifting capability. To do this, they pulled one of the production models from the line and fitted it with two underwing mounted General Electric J85 GE15 jet engines that ran on standard aviation gasoline, and a new wide-track main landing gear taken from a Lockheed C-130 Hercules transport. The resulting YC-123H took to the air for the first time in July 1962. Its performance was quite something. With those two jet engines, the takeoff distance was only 750 feet, and with the 28-foot parachute deployed, it could land in as short as 880 feet. During a test in South Vietnam in the counterinsurgency support role, it flew 180 missions at an average gross rate of £65,000. This proved the YC-123H a successful design. So much so that the USAF issued Fairchild a contract to modify 183B variants with the auxiliary engines and given the designation C-123K. The contract called for installing a pair of underwing pylon-mounted General Electric J85 turbojets producing 2,850 pounds of thrust, one under each wing outboard from the prop engine. This additional thrust would give the C-123 the extra power it needed to make steep climbing turns and of course climb faster, thus decreasing the chance of being hit by ground fire on takeoff. To cut drag when the jets weren't needed, the engine nacelles were fitted with intake doors that could be closed in flight. But it wasn't long before a flaw emerged. In cloud conditions, moisture could seep through the gaps in the closed nacelles and freeze. Then on approach, when the pilot opened the intake doors to start the J85s, the built-up ice would break loose and get sucked into the engines, right into the compressor blades. Needless to say, it didn't take long for pilots to adopt a critical but straightforward procedure. Open the intake doors, wait a few minutes before lighting the jets. As soon as all the testing had been certified and aircrew training completed, the first C-123Ks were deployed to South Vietnam to replace the aging C-123Bs, and initially assigned to Phan Rang Air Base's 315th Tactical Airlift Wing. Pilots who had flown the previous B variants, sometimes by the seat of their pants, were over the moon with the extra thrust, nicknaming the jets afterburners, pushing a big old girl up to 228 miles an hour, dizzying speeds indeed. But darker forces would soon loom over the C-123, casting a shadow that would stretch far beyond Vietnam. Even decades after the war's end, that shadow would linger in the soil, the aircraft, and even the veterans. Before we get into this next chapter, I want to offer a quick disclaimer. What you're about to hear is deeply emotional for many, whether you served in Vietnam, lived there, or have friends or family who did. I've done my best to stick to the facts without exaggeration or dramatization. This is history and it deserves to be told with honesty and respect. With that said, we now come to one of the most controversial and haunting roles of the C-123 would ever play, its transformation from humble transport to an instrument of environmental warfare. Throughout the war, the jungle provided the enemy a means to remain practically invisible under the dense canopy of trees and vegetation. This natural cover allowed the North Vietnamese forces to ambush men, vehicles, boats, and creep up close to stage attacks on bases. Something had to be done to deny them this camouflage. The enemy had to be flushed out or starved. In 1961, President Ngo Dinh Diem of South Vietnam approached the Americans with an idea, likely inspired by what the British had done during the Malayan Emergency, where powerful herbicides had been used as chemical defoliants to strip foliage and destroy the crops of the communist insurgents hidden in the jungle. To some, the proposal made cold, ruthless sense. Herbicides offered a cheap way to strip back the jungle and starve the Viet Cong of both food and cover. Others weren't so sure, skeptical of the strategy's effectiveness, uneasy about turning farmland into dead zones, and wary of how it might look to the rest of the world, exposing the United States to charges of barbarism for waging chemical warfare in blatant contravention of the Geneva Convention. Despite concerns, in November 1961, President Kennedy gave the green light for the US military to launch Ranch Hand for what was to be a 4-month limited aerial defoliation trial in South Vietnam. This would be part of the overall herbicidal warfare program called Operation Trail Dust. These missions would of course in theory be strictly controlled, requiring South Vietnamese cooperation and US approval. But in time it would be expanded to include Laos and Cambodia. The US military tested the suitability of several aircraft, including the T-28, the C-47, the B-26 and the C-123, all outfitted with spraying rigs to dispense herbicides. In the end, the provider was chosen to lead a defoliation campaign, and in late 1961, 6 C-123Bs were sent to be converted at Olmsted Air Force Base in Pennsylvania. Here, they would be fitted with the MC-1 spraying system, a simple but deadly efficient setup, consisting of a 1,000-gallon aluminium tank wrapped in fiberglass insulation, with a pump feeding a set of 6 spray nozzles mounted along a pipe assembly under the wings and tail booms that would dispense herbicides at 3 gallons per acre. Mechanics also removed all unnecessary equipment, installed aluminium alloy armor plating under and alongside the cockpit. In the cargo compartment, they placed an engine oil supply replenishment system consisting of a 55-gallon drum, a hand pump and plumbing to each engine. I also read they added connections so that the 1,000-gallon spray tank could be used as an additional fuel tank so the aircraft could be flown for longer. However, I was not able to find a definitive source for this additional fuel setup. The crews who flew the Ranch Hand missions were handpicked from men who had previously volunteered for the Air Force's counterinsurgency force. Recruitment wasn't a problem. There were no shortage of airmen willing to take on dangerous flying despite the conditions. They'd wear civilian clothes, fly unmarked aircraft, and if captured, they wouldn't be acknowledged as US military. As cloak and dagger as this seemed, in reality they wore uniforms. The aircraft would carry large US Air Force markings, identification numbers, and they also bore a large red identification stripe across the top of the fuselage. This made the camouflage Ranch Hand planes easier to spot for fighter and forward air controller pilots against the backdrop of the jungle. By November 1961, the 6 C-123 Ranch Hand aircraft, now fully outfitted for spray operations, departed Travis AFB. After a series of delays and political hesitations, they were hand-flown via Hawaii and finally arrived at Tan Son Nhut in early 1962 for what was, for the crews, expected to be a 120-day tour and was known simply as a Special Aerial Spray Flight, but soon became the 12th Air Commando Squadron. The first Ranch Hand C-123 test flight took place in January 10, 1962, dispensing 200 gallons of Agent Purple, an early example of the so-called rainbow herbicides, a color-coded group of chemical defoliants that would later include Agents Green, Pink, White, Blue, and the infamous Agent Orange. The latter, mainly produced under license by Monsanto and Dow Chemical Company, was named after the orange stripe painted around the 55-gallon storage drums. The lethality of these chemicals was initially downplayed. Manufacturers claimed that they were harmless to humans, animals, soil and water, reassuring troops and locals alike. Pamphlets were even dropped from the air onto villages, insisting that spray would only target vegetation. Although not an intended ingredient, the highly toxic compound dioxin was a contaminant formed during the production of one of the key components of Agent Orange, which even at the time was known to have profound effects on health and is now classified as a Group 1 carcinogen, amongst the most toxic man-made substances known. Once applied, the herbicide acted quickly, stripping leaves from the branches within days and killing trees and mangrove forests within weeks. But spraying wasn't just limited to the dense jungle interior. It was also carried out around the US bases, where all vegetation had to be removed to create clear lines of sight and deny the North Vietnamese any cover. The defoliants were also used along rivers where there was dense foliage enough to provide the perfect cover for Viet Cong to stage attacks on American patrol boats. Naturally, the chemicals seeped into the waterways. This devastating ability to strip the landscape bare gave rise to the Ranch Handers' darkly ironic motto, "Only we can prevent forests," a grim twist on the well-known US Forest Service slogan from Smokey the Bear campaign, "Only you can prevent forest fires." The official start to operations came 3 days later on the morning of January the 13th, when Captain Carl Marshall and Captain William Robinson took off with 1,000 gallons of herbicide heading to their predetermined target area. Flying in at just 150 feet, though with time and practice they would fly even lower, they chugged along at a pedestrian 130 knots, holding steady to ensure maximum dispersal. Once above the target area, the co-pilot commenced the spraying with a flick of one switch. Although they may have overlooked one thing that morning, during the run, the pilot of an observation plane flying just above the spray aircraft noticed something strange. The herbicide was rising instead of falling. Some of it was even deposited on his windshield. The cause of this phenomenon was that the sun had been up just long enough to warm the air near the ground, creating thermals that stirred the atmosphere, dissipated the spray, and prevented it from settling on the thick jungle below. To stop the herbicide mist from rising rather than falling, all future spray runs were flown early in the morning or late in the afternoon when the temperature was less than 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Also, the wind speed had to be less than 10 miles an hour to keep it drifting off the target. Spray missions were codenamed Trail Dust and flown under the radio call sign Hades. Each target typically saw 3 or 4 unarmed C-123s flying in tight formation. And most ranch hand aircraft operated with 3-man crew, pilot, co-pilot and flight mechanic, along with a Vietnamese observer who, according to the rules of engagement, was designated as the aircraft commander. Interestingly, although the observers held this title, they were not pilots. Additionally, the lead aircraft carried a navigator and was equipped with an automatic direction finder for beacons and a tactical air navigation system for precise navigation. Typically, the C-123s would cruise to the target around 3,000 feet before descending rapidly, sometimes at rates of 2,500 feet per minute to minimize exposure to ground fire. They would then level off as low as 20 feet above the treetops, climbing slightly to begin the spray run, and much like crop dusters, which in a morbid sort of way they were, the aircraft had to fly straight and level, or at least as much as the terrain allowed, for between 4 and 8 minutes, the time it took to empty the tank. However, the footage shows a formation of C-123Bs spraying over hilly terrain, flying somewhat higher. Once the defoliant was exhausted, the aircraft would drop back down to 20 feet and exit the area. Here, precise navigation and sharp airmanship were absolutely critical. Crews had to stay locked on target while avoiding trees, terrain and any other number of unseen jungle hazards. Captain Arthur Art Erickson was a C-123 pilot who saw a lot of action early on in Vietnam. He recalled, "The VC and NVA lived off the crops grown in the south. We sprayed rice field to deny the enemy access to the rice. In my opinion, as a weapon of war, the ranch hand operations contributed positively to the war effort. Unfortunately, it became highly politicized." The opposition said that Agent Orange was a chemical weapon that had been prohibited by international law, while the US stated that it did not harm people, therefore it was not a chemical weapon. Regardless, we had our orders and hit the target without listening too much to what was coming from the States. In December 1963, ranch hand tested night defoliation missions to avoid the day's rising heat and of course be less of a bullet magnet. The first test using flares dropped from a support aircraft was a success, as was the second flight under moonlight. However, contrary to expectations, they came under small arms fire on one of the missions. It was also found that the flares cast flickering shadows that made altitude judgment difficult. While night spraying showed some promise, it never became a significant part of the operation, choosing to stick to early morning flights. However, flying slow, low and close to the jungle meant being a nice fat target for enemy soldiers, coming under fire from everything and everyone on the ground. It was almost a given that at least one aircraft on each mission would come back with a few extra ventilation holes, courtesy of the Viet Cong, which was worrying as the crew's only defense was some light armor and the rugged design of the Provider. One of the older C-123, serial 564362, nicknamed Patches, earned this moniker due to being peppered with over 500 bullet and shrapnel holes. Some even say that number is closer to 1,000, winning at least 40 of them on a single outing. Unsurprisingly, 7 of its crew received the Purple Heart for wounds they received during operations. Patches ultimately became a dedicated insecticide sprayer to control malaria-carrying mosquitoes and was converted to a UC-123K in 1968. Amazingly, Patches still survives today, preserved at the National Museum for the USAF at Dayton, Ohio. Although all crew members wore flak jackets to protect against ground fire, a serious hazard, aside from the risk of being shot down, was faced by those in a cargo compartment. There, shrapnel or bullets could puncture hydraulic or herbicide lines, potentially spraying caustic chemicals into their eyes. In such cases, they relied on bottles of distilled water carried on board to flush their eyes immediately. But it was not uncommon for the pipes and fittings to leak, with herbicide working its way into every nook and cranny. According to accounts online, Agent Orange would coat everything inside the fuselage. If that were not bad enough, the toxic fumes would fill the cabin and cockpit. No surprise that even the vegetation around the unit's parking area at Tan Son Nhut would soon wither and die. But it wouldn't be long before the first loss came on February 2, 1962, when a C-123 serial 554531 on a training flight crashed near Ben Hua, killing its 3 crewmen, Captain Fergus Groves II, Captain Robert Larson, and Staff Sergeant Milo Coghill. Tragically, they became the first US Air Force casualties in Vietnam, and the first of many C-123 crews and aircraft to be lost in the conflict. It was never determined what had caused the crash, but a typical daytime mission drew enough attention that ranch hand aircraft would return with at least half a dozen extra holes. So from that point, all C-123 aircraft had to have escorts, starting with A-1 Sky Raiders, later F-100s or F-4s for security. If the area was quiet, fighter escorts loitered overhead. But when resistance was likely, even a low-level dry run by the escorts was often enough to keep enemy gunners in check. But if the mechanic observed ground fire, he would toss a purple smoke grenade out the rear door. The pilot would then radio the forward air controller, who would in turn direct the fighters to the enemy guns. As ranch hand operations began to draw heavier enemy fire, a tactic known as heavy suppression was introduced. Here, fighter aircraft would strike the target area with bombs and strafing runs just minutes before the C-123s arrived to spray. If the primary zone proved too hot to risk the flight, the crews would divert to a pre-planned secondary target so the mission could still deliver its payload somewhere. Despite their protection, ranch hand crews still faced real danger. By the end of operations, the aircraft would receive over 7,000 hits, earning the unenviable reputation as the most shot at US Air Force aircraft in Southeast Asia. In 1964, Ranch Hand was officially assigned to the 309th Air Commando Squadron, with aircraft later redesignated as UC-123s, distinguishing them from the standard cargo versions of the Provider. Later that year, the unit moved from Tan Son Nhut to Ben Hua Airfield just outside Saigon, and with this relocation, the area of operations expanded to include parts of Laos for the first time. As the US military's commitment in South Vietnam deepened through 1964 and 1965, requests for defoliation missions increased. What started a year with just 4 operational aircraft soon saw Ranch Hand's fleet grow to 11 UC-123Bs. During this time, mechanics installed a water spray system on the windshield to wash away herbicide buildup and restore visibility. Additionally, side armor plating protecting both pilots was moved forward and thickened from half an inch to a full inch to better protect them even against a 30 caliber round. But there are only so many times the dice can be rolled. Flying low and slow over the jungle would eventually take its toll. In June 1966, Project Ranch Hand suffered its first combat loss. During a defoliation flight over Quang Tri, province of South Vietnam's northern sector, 2 aircraft came under sporadic ground fire while making their runs. On their 5th pass over the target, one of the aircraft took a fatal hit to its engine and crashed. 6 nearby US Marine Corps helicopters quickly responded, with 2 landing at the crash site, rescuing 3 crew members near the burning wreckage. Another UC-123 was lost in October. Although the aircraft was totally destroyed, its crew was also rescued. Near the end of 1966, the Ranch Hand fleet of UC-123s had increased to 14, which bumped the number of sorties to 4 per day. But just a few months later, a 3rd aircraft was lost to ground fire, this time over Laos with no survivors. By early 1968, following a year of intensifying operations, ranch hand flights were briefly paused for the Tet holiday in Vietnam, offering a rare moment of respite. However, the calm was shattered on January 31st in 1968 when Viet Cong forces launched a massive coordinated assault across South Vietnam, including an attack on the ranch hand base at Ben Hoa, the largest offensive of the war up to that point. In response, ranch hand crews quickly mobilized, flying 2,800 emergency airlift sorties across the country. Defoliation missions resumed 2 months later, but in May the unit suffered its fifth loss. When another ranch hand aircraft was shot down, all crew members were lost. That same month, the first of the upgraded UC-123K variants arrived, with its twin J-85 jet engines, a much appreciated insurance as it improved the odds for survivability in the event of an engine loss. As 1969 came to a close, so did the frequency of ranch hand operations. From an average of 400 sorties per month in '69, the number of missions dwindled to just 43 by the last quarter of 1970, with most of the would-be idle UC-123Ks assigned to fly cargo. Ranch hand's final defoliation mission took place on the 7th of January 1971, with the program officially ending later that month. From 1962 to 1971, the C-123 flew more than 20,000 sorties. It had officially sprayed nearly 19 million gallons of various herbicides across a fifth of South Vietnam's jungle and over a third of its mangrove forests, an area the size of Massachusetts. The most notorious of these chemicals being Agent Orange, of which at least 11 million gallons were applied in concentrations many times that intended for agricultural use, devastating forests and farmlands of friend and foe alike. Some sources say the numbers are much higher, but the exact figures are hard to discern. What began as a limited experiment became one of Vietnam's war's most haunting legacies. The Vietnamese government estimates that the herbicide campaign caused over 400,000 deaths, a number the US government has disputed as unreliable. But beyond the numbers are the millions who have endured lifelong illnesses, disability and generational harm. Unfortunately, the UC-123K spray aircraft were reassigned to Air Force Reserve units for cargo and medical evacuation missions. From 1972 to 1982, crews unknowingly logged thousands of hours in planes whose airframes had absorbed years of toxic herbicides baked by the tropical Southeast Asian sun. Over time, these aircraft became flying chemical traps, leaking vapors into cabins and cockpits. The fumes often caused nausea, eye irritation and other symptoms, though at the time few understood why or cared enough to ask. However, internal memos later revealed that the Air Force legal officers advised keeping toxicity concerns confidential. In a letter to Senator Tom Daschle, Dr. James L. Clary, a former Air Force scientist who worked on a herbicide program, admitted that military scientists were aware of the potential harm from dioxin contamination as early as the 1960s. He stated that they knew the military formulation contained higher levels of dioxin than the civilian version due to faster and cheaper manufacturing methods. However, he wrote, "Because the material was to be used on the enemy, none of us were overly concerned." Reports also emerged of contaminated aircraft being sold overseas or displayed publicly, including one at Robbins AFB's museum. In 2010, due to rising health concerns, the Air Force destroyed all remaining surplus C-123Ks, melting them down to prevent further exposure. The Department of Veterans Affairs estimates that nearly 3 million American personnel were exposed to Agent Orange, with hundreds of thousands still suffering long-term health effects. The irony, one not lost on the veterans, is that the defoliation program was supposed to save American lives. But for many, the war never ended. Its consequences would follow them home. The Vietnam War has no shortage of stories, no more so than in the realms of covert and special operations. So it was no surprise that it wouldn't be long before the C-123 was at the center of another of the US military's ambitious operations. Throughout the war, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, practically invisible under the dense canopy of trees, provided the North Vietnamese forces with a vital supply route to deliver arms, fighters, and other supplies to South Vietnam. During the day, the trail would come under constant attack from American bombs in the vain hope of stopping or at least slowing the flow of supplies. But it had become clear to the US Air Force that they had a glaring gap in their tactical night capabilities. Finding and striking elusive targets like the Ho Chi Minh Trail was already difficult in daylight. At night or in poor weather, it was nearly impossible. What they needed was the ability to strike accurately in the dark or through foul weather. This challenge spawned Operation Shedlight in 1966, a program rapidly put together to transform nighttime aerial warfare, with the C-123 Provider, already a workhorse in Vietnam, becoming a testbed for some of the program's most ambitious experiments. One approach to guiding gunship strikes against enemy positions in Vietnam's darkened jungles involved using the C-123Ks as flare ships. Just before America entered into the war in Indochina, Air Force specialists began developing a new type of illumination flare, designated MLU-32B99 or Brit-Eye, which were parachute flares that burned with 5 million candle power for over 5 minutes and produced an audio signal to warn attack aircraft pilots of impending burnout. Operating under the call sign Candle, these missions were flown primarily by the US Air Force's 4-Team Special Operations Wing, supporting fixed-wing gunships like the AC-47 Spooky and the AC-119G Shadow during nighttime engagements. A single C-123B was transformed into a flying chandelier under the Battlefield Illumination Airborne System or BIAS. This aircraft was fitted with a special movable housing containing 28 xenon arc high-intensity lamps across 2 banks on the lower tailgate, and to prevent the whole thing from going up in flames, a cooling system had to be jerry-rigged onto the fuselage to help dissipate the lamp's scorching heat. Each bank blazed away, capable of lighting a 2-mile diameter area when the aircraft was at 12,000 feet, enough light to turn midnight into noon. You can imagine how ghostly it must have been, like something out of Apocalypse Now. However, it didn't take long before the drawbacks to this plan began to surface. The pilots, who nicknamed the setup the Disco Mule, would complain that the glare reflecting off their instruments made it difficult to read their gauges. Although the lamps did a splendid job of lighting up the jungle, but they also painted a massive bullseye for the Viet Cong anti-aircraft gunners, who didn't need asking twice to take shots at such an inviting target. Who would have thought it? Although it was deployed briefly in 1967, BIAS was quickly shelved after taking enemy fire, which made it clear that the lumbering C-123's dazzling display made it too vulnerable. But the trials taught engineers critical lessons about battlefield illumination that would shape later programs. However, Project Shedlight was not yet done. Next came Project Blackspot, a radical effort to turn the C-123 into a self-contained night attack platform. This concept began in September 1965 before Shedlight's formal launch, and was folded into the project as the program's flagship experiment. 2 C-123Ks were modified by E-Systems in Greenville, Texas, and redesignated NC-123K, although they were quite often referred to as the AC-123K. These were outfitted with an arsenal of sci-fi equipment, including a 57.75-inch nose fairing that housed an X-band forward-looking radar. A turret had a low light level TV and a forward-looking infrared, plus a laser rangefinder and Doppler navigation radar. The cargo bay, once stuffed with rice sacks, now held 2 aluminium dispensers for cluster bomblets. These dispensers could hold up to 6,300 of the nasty little BLU-26s that would drop through trapdoors in the floor. These blackspot mules, as crews call them, could detect and strike moving targets at night without flares, a leap towards Shedlight's goal of a self-contained night attack aircraft that needed no external illumination. The blackspot C-123s first proved their mettle in 1968, not in Vietnam but in South Korea, where they were deployed from Osan Air Base to hunt North Korean infiltration boats after the USS Pueblo's capture, flying 57 missions from August to October and nabbing small craft under the cover of darkness. Buoyed by this success, the Air Force sent both aircraft to Phan Rang Air Base in South Vietnam on October 15, 1968, staging operations from Pleiku. Over the next 6 months, they flew nearly 200 missions, and with the help of their onboard sensors that could detect engine heat, destroyed hundreds of trucks and damaging many hundreds more along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Pilots were naturally thrilled by the tech, but they were wary of the anti-aircraft fire, therefore they flew with night fighter escorts. One pilot joked that the NC-123K's radar saw better than my eyes, but they couldn't duck bullets. By June 1970, the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, the aircraft's last unit, recommended cancellation, citing the C-123's lack of armour and the AC-130's superior firepower, which had eclipsed Black Spot under Project Gunship. Black Spot's legacy was mixed. Plans for 20 production aircraft at $64 million came to nothing when trials revealed the C-123's vulnerabilities, and the proposed Black Spot 2 using the C-130s never materialized. So by 1972, both NC-123Ks were mothballed at Napier Field, Alabama, their mission eclipsed by the AC-130s. C-123 loss rates were high in the Southeast Asia theatre, with 54 airframes being lost from 1962 to 1971, representing around 1/6 of the entire fleet. 17 of these were combat losses, whereas the other 37 were due to non-combat related causes. Weather and mountainous terrain pose significant challenges. Tropical storms could flare up quickly. Some of the worst C-123 losses involved aircraft striking terrain in bad weather. The worst being on 11th of September 1965, when a C-123B carrying 4 crew and 81 South Vietnamese paratroopers, while flying in poor visibility, struck trees on a ridgeline at around 4,000 feet. The final USAF C-123 mission was flown on June 14, 1972. After that, operations passed to the South Vietnamese Air Force, with the 315th Air Commando Wing staying briefly in an advisory role until the US withdrawal in 1973. Even after the war, the rugged provider would find new masters, with various questionable outfits around the world. It flew for Air America, the CIA's clandestine airline, and for Taiwan's Black Bat Squadron, slipping through hostile skies across Southeast Asia. One C-123 even turned up in the Iran-Contra affair, flying weapons to Nicaraguan Contras in a covert war bankrolled by secret arms sales to Iran. That tangled web of clandestine ops, proxy wars and political fallout is a whole story in itself, one for another time. Although I will say that when the clandestine operations were suspended, one of the C-123s used in the scheme was abandoned at the international airport at San Jose, and it ended up being bought and is now a rather splendid looking restaurant in Costa Rica called El Avion. The Royal Thai Air Force pushed the airframe's limits with the C-123T, a 1980s experiment fitting Allison T-56 turboprops to a C-123K, increasing speed and payload. But budget cuts halted the program in 1981. The C-123 would find a home across the globe, serving in air forces of El Salvador, Venezuela, the Khmer Republic, Cambodia, the Philippines, Saudi Arabia, South Korea and Laos, whether delivered factory fresh or having arrived through less salubrious means. A handful of providers found civilian lives hauling cargo in Alaska or starring in films like ConAir, where a C-123K painted to look menacing crashed on the Las Vegas Strip, or in Air America with Mel Gibson and Robert Downey Jr., or more recently in a Tom Cruise film, American Made. Does anyone know the other films? I'll give you a clue. It's in one of the best Christmas films ever made, starring Bruce Willis. Most, however, have since been scrapped or retired to museums. Today, the last known flying Bookie Bird is a lone C-123K named Thunderpig, proudly maintained and flown by the Air Heritage Aviation Museum. The Provider story is one of relentless adaptation, from Strukov's glider dreams to Vietnam's muddy strips and over the jungles of Nicaragua. In fact, I had to cut a few out of this one, or we'd be here all day, and I doubt anyone wants to watch a 10-hour video. So I decided a couple of them deserved standalone episodes of their own, like the incredible rescue at Cam Duke, where Major Joe Jackson became the only man in Vietnam to be awarded the Medal of Honor flying a transport aircraft. That is an incredible story. Although she started as a glider, the C-123 went on to do pretty much everything and was beloved by pilots who could rely on the Bookie Bird to get anything, anywhere, anytime, professionally. If you've made it this far, I thank you. Please consider subscribing if you yet haven't and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. And a big thank you to Incogni for sponsoring this video and helping to keep the tea flowing and the biscuits varied. I'll see you next time.